Well, hello. My name is Twyla Tardif, and I would like to welcome you today to the fifth presentation of our virtual LRCCS Noon Lecture Series, Winter Term 2021. I am director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and am delighted to introduce our speaker for today's talk. Our complete series schedule is available on our center's website, and email reminders go out weekly. At the end of today's presentation, I invite you to submit any questions that you may have for our speaker by typing your questions into the Q&A function, and you can do this at any time during the talk. And at the end of the lecture, I will read and moderate the questions to our speaker. And first, I would like to begin with an announcement. So our next presentation in the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies Noon Lecture Series will be held next Tuesday, February 23rd, and will be given by Eli Wu, who is University of Michigan Associate Professor of History and Women's Studies, and she will be speaking on myth-busting the history of Chinese medicine, going beyond the function, not structure stereotype. So look forward to hearing that lecture next week. All right, so today's presentation will be given by Silvia Lindtner, Associate Professor at U of M's School of Information. Dr. Lindtner researches, writes, and teaches about DIY, do-it-yourself, maker culture, with a particular focus on its intersections with manufacturing and industry development in China. Drawing on her background in interaction design and media studies, she merges ethnographic methods with approaches in design and making. This allows her to provide deep insights into emerging cultures of technology production and use from a sociological and technological perspective. Together with Anna Greenspan from NYU and David Lee, Professor Lindtner is also the co-founder of the research initiative Hacked Matter. Hacked Matter has, since its inception in 2011, organized a series of workshops, lectures, public panel discussions, as well as hands-on engagements with questions of DIY making, manufacturing, and innovation ecosystems. Her talk today will be based on her new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. So thank you, Dr. Lindtner, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Twyla, for these kind introductory words. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you all today. I'm just going to start the screen share. I hope you can see. Thank you again, Twyla, and thank you so much also, Ina, for all your work behind the scenes to make this remote talk possible today. I'm really honored to share with you some of the key concepts and stories from my new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation, that Twyla just mentioned. And I just want to say it is really meaningful for me to present this work here today. The Lieberthal-Rogel Center has supported me greatly in completing this book, including co-sponsorship of a manuscript workshop in 2018, as well as research support, in addition to providing a rich intellectual home here on campus. The book draws on over 10 years of ethnographic research, out of which I spent 5 years full-time in China. And so my talk today will be weaving together specific stories and sites from this research to examine the role that digital technology production plays in contemporary governance in China, in geopolitics, but also in labor and policy. And importantly, this book, and also my talk today, is a feminist ethnography of the global that really aims to interrogate and challenge simplistic questions of what might be a uniquely Chinese approach to technology innovation, or how China is different from the West when it comes to tech innovation. Instead, I showed that a study of technology production in China today has much to say, for instance, not only about China's current governance structures and processes, but also about Western imperialism and control, about shifting geopolitics and China-US relations. So I'll be talking for about 40 minutes today, and then there will be time for Q&A, and I really look forward to your comments and questions then. Let me begin my talk with this image. What you see here on the screen is a photograph of one of China's first makerspaces, Chaihuo. It is a roughly 15 by 10 square meter room on the second floor of a refurbished factory building in a so-called creative industry park in the city of Shenzhen in the south of China. It's a small community space that provides its members with access to things like low-cost machines, open source tools and platforms to hack and tinker with hardware. These types of maker spaces, or hacker spaces as they were often also referred to, have proliferated in the thousands around the globe in the years following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. These hacker spaces were not the spaces frequented by the type of hackers that are more typically portrayed in movies. So think young men illegally accessing information or breaking security barriers. Rather, the hacking that took place in spaces like Chaihuo was a project of self-transformation from a passive consumer into a maker, somebody who intervened in social, economic, and political processes via technological experimentation. So people who identified with this particular form of making produced prototypes that made this promise of intervention concrete. They made, for instance, DIY cell phones that showed that you, rather than a big corporate player like Apple, for instance, can control the design and the inner workings of our communication devices. They opened up proprietary health devices to demonstrate how you and I can regain ownership of our body's data, like this project here on the screen that hacked the glucose monitoring device Dexcom to create an artificial pancreas. And they made open source 3D printers to make pulpable how you can mass produce in your own home. These prototypes of intervention demoed, so to say, how to see oneself as capable of intervening in things like industrial production, automation, and broken healthcare systems. They created a feeling of being able to intervene at scale, I argue in the book, from the individual body to national and globalized industrial production. They promised to return the means of production to the people. In 2012, the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, celebrated this very promise in his book on the topic as follows, and this is a quote from the book. "The ability to manufacture local or global at will is a huge advantage. That simple menu option of a digitized machine like the 3D printer compresses 3 centuries of industrial revolution into a single mouse click. If Karl Marx was here today, his jaw would be on the floor. Talk about controlling the tools of production. You can now set factories into motion with a mouse click." Anderson's book was one of many other prominent writings on making at the time that invoked socialist imagery and language. They claimed that making would return control to the people, that it would democratize industrial production, and that it was a tool to achieve social justice and undo large corporate monopolies and state power. Quite different from Karl Marx, though, who understood alternatives to capitalism as emerging from things like class struggles, solidarity movements, and the collectivization of workers. These writings portrayed individual self-actualization as desirable, as you can see it also here in this quote. Notably here, Anderson describes making's transformative power as stemming not from a collective we, for instance, but from many individuals, from many yous. These writings and projects construed one of the core techniques of neoliberal governance, so this framing of the self in economic terms, as desirable and as enabling social change. They produced what seems to be an inherent contradiction and what I call in the book a socialist pitch. So pitching is typically associated with a startup's ability to formulate itself as attractive to venture capital by producing a feeling of anticipation and a promise of scale. The socialist pitch derives its power from this very technique of producing an affect of exuberant excitement and buy-in, but drawing specifically on the language and image of social change and justice. Pitching, of course, works through promise rather than actual change. So VC investors, for instance, fund ideas and prototypes rather than finished products. The socialist pitch then is aimed not at social justice per se, but at creating a feeling that technological intervention itself is social justice. And this is something that I show throughout the book and that I will also show in this talk today. So Chaihua Makerspace, with which I began this talk, had become a well-known member of what prominent figures like Chris Anderson had pitched as a global movement that would return power and control to the people. This is not the kind of space where one would expect to find the Prime Minister of China on an official state visit. And as surprising as it seems, though, China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang did, though, visit Chaihua Makerspace and endorsed its prototypes of intervention on an official state visit in January 2015. During his visit, the Prime Minister declared, "Makers show the vitality of entrepreneurship and innovation among the people, and such creativity will serve as a lasting engine of China's economic growth in the future." The Prime Minister's visit to Chaihua was documented vividly by state media. The government website posted a photo essay portraying the Prime Minister surrounded by a crowd of young Chinese men who showed off their latest technological creations, and you can see some of the photos here. The photos depict a highly personable Prime Minister who appeared to be enjoying to mingle with the group of young men. The message was that the Prime Minister was himself a maker at heart and a politician who was invested in empowering citizens to make things happen, how state media put it at that time. Most importantly, though, the endorsement of makerspaces like Chaihua by the CCP, China's Communist Party, positioned the young men depicted side by side the Prime Minister as so-called model makers, so young Chinese engineers who had transformed themselves via the socialist pitch into entrepreneurial change makers who would, by prototyping themselves, also prototype the nation anew. So only a couple of months after the Prime Minister had returned to the capital Beijing, he announced a new national policy that escalated making into a nationwide project. The policy was written around three key terms that I put here on the slides, which translate loosely into English as mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, and mass innovation. These terms framed the policy's key directive, which called upon provincial, municipal, and district level governments to allocate existing resources towards setting up mass makerspaces modeled on Chaihua. The policy was aimed at cultivating a so-called maker spirit amongst the masses, which is how this policy stipulated it, a spirit that would in turn help foster a so-called attitude of self-making and self-entrepreneurship. So in other words, the policy held up making as a technique of self-transformation from an economic actor into an entrepreneurial actor. So in my book, Prototype Nation, I offer an ethnographic study of making for what it can tell us about the role that technology plays in contemporary governance in China. I explore how the promise of democratized tech innovation, as championed by maker advocates, became a techno-political instrument of affect. That as a techno-political instrument of affect served the CCP, so the Chinese government's broader interests, to reposition China as a forward-looking and innovative nation. Crucially, it mobilized feelings of optimism, positivity, and happiness in the very moment that China's Communist Party feared social and political instability due to China's first significant economic slowdown since the economic opening reforms in the 1980s. So by Prototype Nation then, I mean the stipulation that a nation can and should function as a prototype, that a nation and its citizenry serve as the raw material, so to say, for a new model. For instance, China as modeling an alternative to Western approaches of tech innovation and economic development. The idea that a nation can function as a prototype, as a way of modeling a new way of life for others, is of course not new. It is historically constituted through projects of modernization, economic development, and colonization. The historian R.F. Dierlich reminds us that the European invention of the nation state was the ultimate vehicle of modernity. In other words, the European nation was positioned as a prototype of modern progress and economic development, with Europe positioned as the archetype. Other regions were construed as in need to learn from the Western model nations. This very colonial project of prototyping a certain way of life, I argue, endures through the ideals and practices of contemporary technology innovation. Colonial pasts and racialized forms of violence reverberate through the prototype nation. And to show how exactly this unfolds is a key task of the book, and is also then my goal in this talk today. As a feminist ethnography that weaves together sensibilities from critical race, post-colonial, and science and technology studies, the book attends to the bodies and sites that were excluded from this very reinvestment in the nation and in certain people and regions with the exuberant feeling of excitement of future making and happiness. It was no coincidence that China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang endorsed the makerspace Chaihuo that is located in Shenzhen, rather than any of the other hundreds of such spaces that had operated in China at the time in other cities all over the country. The same year of the Prime Minister's visit to Shenzhen, Wired magazine published the following issue that claimed that it was now time to copy China, with a series of essays about tech innovation in Shenzhen. The cover featured a story of Lei Jun, the founder of Xiaomi, a mobile phone company that had grown out of what many people had begun referring to as Shenzhen's unique innovation ecosystem. Wired's cover was really a culmination of Western media coverage about Shenzhen that had, within the time span of only a few years, rewritten the region in the global tech imagination. So what had long been decried as a site of mere execution of Western ideas, low quality and copycat production, which was sort of the image of Shenzhen, and arguably still in some ways is the image of Shenzhen in certain conversations, was suddenly celebrated as what Wired, for instance, began referring to as the Silicon Valley of hardware, or the new hothouse of innovation, as where entrepreneurs go to lead the future and to even outdo Silicon Valley. These stories proliferated in the years following the 2007 and 8 financial crisis. So the years following the crisis are really important to sort of position this and understand the sort of historical moment when these narratives were shifting. So the years following the crisis were marked by a reckoning with the complicity of technology in labor exploitation, resource extraction, capitalist expansion. So not only scholars, but a growing number of news media and commentators began warning about the costs of ruthless neoliberal capitalism and the precarious conditions of work it created. And increasingly, people criticized Silicon Valley as a central culprit in this destabilization. China as prototype nation, so as a contested alternative to Western approaches to tech innovation, I argue, was co-produced by this specific techno-crisis thinking that is more recently often also referred to as the techlash, that was particularly pronounced in the United States. So it was a moment when the tech industry and Silicon Valley in particular found itself confronted with a growing suspicion that the values it had propagated since the 1990s, so the countercultural ideal, that of tearing down hierarchies and in the hierarchies place, build a peer-to-peer, a collaborative society, as Fred Turner in 2015 has described it, that countercultural dream and ideal had benefited only a small minority. And on the screen here, of course, you see an image of that countercultural vision, Apple's 1984 ad for the Macintosh computer. So it was in this moment of proliferating doubt over this very promise that China, and more precisely the south of China, the city of Shenzhen, were re-articulated by a range of actors who had been active in the global tech industry, in policy, in politics, in tech production, as a place where the future was now made, as newly innovative, exactly because it had long been and continues to be understood as not as modern as the West. So to give you an example, for instance, in 2014, Choi Ito was at that time still director of the MIT Media Lab, traveled with a group of his students and faculty to Shenzhen. Upon his return, he gave a TED Talk in which he argued that traveling to Shenzhen was like going back in time and learning from the past, momentarily reliving the foundations of Japan's own technological and economic success. A discourse of adventure and exploration engulfed stories like this, which is kind of like an invention, can think of it as an invention of China, visible also here in this quote from an interview conducted with the director of a Silicon Valley funded incubator program that had opened up in Shenzhen in 2012. Chinese people here are articulated as making things happen and as providing agency to the Western innovator, engineer, and designer who had begun to increasingly feel precarity, gig work, and defeminization of his own creative labor. So Shenzhen, these men promised, was a place where one could feel again in control. And the casual reference to the pop science fiction series Star Trek here at the end of the quote of boldly going where no man has gone before, I argue is not to underestimate in this context, and indeed was a frequent reference I heard when people would describe Shenzhen, and especially these people in these tech innovation programs. As a narrative of American frontierism, references to Star Trek legitimized, I argue, an engagement with China based on a masculine and colonial narrative of adventure, exploration, and technological mastery. So if space was the final frontier to be mastered by individuals empowered by the latest technological advances, which is the story of Star Trek, this applying the story of Star Trek to China and to Shenzhen here frames China as the untamed land of copycat to be mastered by the maker turned entrepreneur. In 2013, I spent a year embedded as an ethnographer in one such foreign-funded incubator program in Shenzhen. The promotional materials of the program claimed that it was, quote unquote, taking the maker movement to the next level. It was invested, so to say, in makers whose prototypes promised to scale into investable products, so data-driven solutions, robots, drones, smart systems, Internet of Things, wearable technologies, and so on. Backed by a Silicon Valley venture capital firm that has strategically located its headquarters in Ireland for tax reduction purposes, the investors and managers that ran the incubator were a group of powerful white men who were well known in the circles of global capital investment. They appropriated socialist imagery of China's past to pitch the location of their program in Shenzhen in revolutionary terms, and you can see here one example on the screen. By embedding themselves into the city's electronic markets, its factories and supply chains, makers would learn, so to say, how to become real-world entrepreneurs. That was the pitch of the program. They would no longer tinker with electronics in a makerspace or in a basement, but hack economies of scale, global supply chains, and capitalism itself. In chapters 4 and 5 of the book, I show in much depth how this socialist pitch of entrepreneurial life in Shenzhen that refashioned colonial discourses of frontier making, of adventure and control, operates as a market device of finance capitalism. It remoralizes, in other words, the economization of humans and things. So the economization of life, as it is defined in STS, is that life itself should serve the interests of investors and markets, is here portrayed as hopeful and as providing individuals with a hacktivist agency. In the political and economic regime of tech innovation and venture capital, Capitalist expansion is pitched, in other words, as participatory, as available to everyone. Processes of economization and capitalist expansion no longer appear to just be a natural consequence of competition, but rather appear to be hackable, something we can make our own. In other words, the neoliberal doctrine of inevitability, which is the idea that capitalist expansion and automation and so on are a natural process rather than the outcome of human choices, is imbued here with a feeling of agency. Economic life is framed as entrepreneurial life. During my ethnographic engagement with the incubator, I spent much time with Sophie and Mei Yun, two of the Chinese staff workers, two women employed by the incubator. This is how the director of the incubator introduced these two women on the first day of the program. He said, "There's a thing about Sophie and Mei Yun. They're the office managers. They make our lives better. They will make sure shit works around here. If it doesn't work, just remember it must be their fault. Repeat after me, nothing is my fault. It must be their fault. When shit is broken, talk to them." The introduction to the two female Chinese staff set the tone for how the startups would approach them over the months to follow. Their job was to help guide the startup teams through the emotional ups and downs of their entrepreneurial labor in Shenzhen. When shit was broken, they would fix it. When the stress levels amongst the startups went up, Sophie and Mei Yun would provide distraction and think of fun leisure activities. The responsibility was, really unlike the startups, to stay in the background, to take care of the program's day-to-day functioning and the startup's well-being. It also included the labor to organize and accompany factory tours. So factory tours were really crucial for especially the foreign startups that this incubator invested in, and it invested at that time mostly in foreign-based startups. So these factory tours were really important for them, not only to build relationships to partners in manufacturing, but also to produce the kind of affect of entrepreneurial life that so many had come to associate with Shenzhen, as I talked about it earlier. So this feeling that by embedding themselves into China's manufacturing and supply chain networks, people would be able to hack and intervene on a scale of the political economy that seemed typically out of reach for the designer and engineer. So over the years of research, I met many young women and some young men who were hired into positions not unlike Sophie and Mei Yun. They were hired to perform what I call in the book happiness labor. That is the work that goes into producing a feeling of optimism and cheerful delight. It is in some ways not unlike what Ali Hochschild has described as emotional labor, but more specifically is the kind of labor that a range of new organizational models of technology production, so think incubators, co-working spaces, maker spaces, innovation hubs, that they rely on in order to sustain the precarious conditions of entrepreneurial life that they demand and celebrate. Happiness labor, in other words, allows the entrepreneur to sustain a good feeling about technology, despite the increasing realization that for many, the self-investment will never pay off. Many of the young women and men I found employed in jobs like these in China spoke fluent English, which they had acquired through rigorous self-study or college education. Many of them were also severely underpaid and were often paid about the same or at times even less than the migrant workers employed in the factories just next door. Over time, the kind of happiness labor that was part of Sophie and Mei Yun's work became normalized amongst the startup teams. They began relating to them as friends and saw their labor as a form of peer production. The startup's revision of Sophie and Mei Yun's role from a worker to a peer masked the gendered divisions of labor at the incubator and the uneven positionality between the firm's female employees and the mostly male and mostly white entrepreneurs it invested in. So following the 2015 government initiative that I mentioned earlier on building innovation or mass maker spaces for the people, spaces like the Silicon Valley funded incubator where I did my field work in 2012 and 13 had become a model of sorts for a gradual but massive urban upgrade in Shenzhen. Old production sites, like the Shenzhen's electronic markets depicted here on the left side of the screen, were redesigned to look like the incubator and maker spaces the government had identified as cultivating an entrepreneurial maker spirit amongst the masses. And you see one such upgrade on the right side of the screen here. This aesthetic upgrade of the city was meant to build what I call the entrepreneurial factory. So the entrepreneurial factory, I argue, operates by producing feelings instead of products. It is aimed at inducing in workers and engineers, for instance, in China's industrial production industry, the desire to see themselves as passionate entrepreneurial change makers, to turn themselves into assets on behalf of the nation, and to serve the Chinese government's project of industrial upgrade, like the Made in China 2025 initiative, or its global development projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative. The entrepreneurial factory operates alongside what the autonomist and feminist Marxists have famously called the social factory. They called it the social factory to describe how capital subsumes various aspects of social life for the accumulation of value. I use the concept of the entrepreneurial factory to demonstrate that it is not only true that factory-like conditions and factory-like exploitation is seeping into various corners of our lives, like think gig work and so on, but that the inverse is the case as well, that factory work itself is increasingly shaped by the kinds of exploitation we see happening in the creative and tech industries. So in my research, I followed several young men working in manufacturing who the entrepreneurial factory enrolled in. And I followed them really to understand how did it affect them and what does this actually mean in practice? So one of them was Robin, who you can see here on the screen. When I first met Robin, he was 30 years old. He had moved to Shenzhen from a rural part of China at the urging of a relative who helped him obtain a fellowship at a local car manufacturer and leave behind a life in agriculture. I stayed in touch with Robin over the years. In 2016, I visited his office at the outskirts of the city. He had invited me to meet over tea to tell me about an exciting new business opportunity. A childhood friend from his hometown in rural Hunan had opened up a shoe factory in Ethiopia. The idea was that Robin would get a section of the factory to have some of his own electronic products assembled there. The shoe factory's promotional material signaled more than an attractive business venture. Echoing some of the official rhetoric of the government around its Belt and Road Initiative, the story here was one about mutual growth, win-win, with China's own history of rapid economic development posited as a model for Africa. There was no direct government support, though Robin emphasized when I talked with him about this. The expectation was that China's entrepreneurs would self-invest by going out, or 出去 in Chinese. While the personal and professional risks could be high, going out was understood as carrying potential to redeem China from a place known as fake and low quality to a place of cutting-edge innovation by way of upgrading oneself from a backwards farmer or backwards producer, like Robin saw himself, into a globally savvy entrepreneur. In the words of Robin, this is a matter of feeling responsible. In Shenzhen, people push you to go farther, but our responsibility, our mission also becomes a burden. We are responsible for many workers, and this makes us feel like we cannot stop, we cannot let go. A year later, when I returned to Shenzhen and met with Robin, he had moved into a new office located in one of Shenzhen's newest and most prime real estates, Shenzhen Bay. As we sat in his new office, 30 floors up the modern high-rise overlooking a pristine golf course landscape, Robin showed me the video conferencing system he had set up and the photos from his latest trip to Ethiopia and Kenya. This was not it, however. He interrupted himself suddenly as we spoke. I envy you. You're respected, no matter where you go. When I go to Africa, or if I went to the United States, I'm not respected. That's why we still have aspirations. That's why we hope to be respected. This is my goal. I'm pursuing this goal. That's why, although today I could have a really good life, I'm still living the life of a loser. The Entrepreneurial Factory, I argue, runs exactly on this promise of the good life, continuously postponed for many Chinese men like Robin, deemed low quality and still not representative of the nation's modern ambitions, and especially for many Chinese women who are relegated to happiness labor. A couple of days after my visit, Robin sent me a WeChat message with the following news clipping from the Daily Mail in the UK. Its headline reading, Shenzhen, China's reform pioneer leads tech revolution. Not without a hint of pride, Robin directed me to read till the end of the article, where it featured him right next to one of the American investors who had begun play an active role in the city. It is this exact attachment to whiteness that promised happiness and to overcome racism in the present that made many people I encountered in China's manufacturing industry to endure the violence of the entrepreneurial factory that demanded of them to take more and more risks, to self-economize, to overwork, and to take responsibility on behalf of the nation and the party state. I built here on the critical race and feminist scholar and philosopher Sarah Ahmed's notion of the promise of happiness. This is a quote from her book. The civilizing mission of the colonial periods could be described as a happiness mission. Colonized people were framed as lacking the qualities or attributes necessary for a happy state of existence. Almost the same, but not quite. Almost the same, but not white. Almost happy, but not quite. The Chinese Communist Party state continuously and strategically invokes China's past of partial colonization, which it refers to as the period of national humiliation. It portrays citizens like Robin as lacking in civility and quality and is in need of modern upgrade. Only then will the nation be redeemed from this past. The Entrepreneurial Factory posits certain people and certain spaces as the right prototype, so to say, of this very project and of China's plans to build an indigenous innovation economy, of the Chinese dream, a happy nation. It was via the appropriation of making and its associations with happiness and agency that the CCP could pitch itself as acting in the interest of the people, as committed to people's pursuits of happiness. In other words, the CCP appears almost like a benevolent, optimistic peer of the people who works right in step with people's dreams and hopes for justice. Under President Xi Jinping, the pursuit of happiness, feminist scholar Chia Yang shows us, has been rendered a moral imperative for the so-called quality modern citizen. The CCP, which is more commonly associated with top-down authoritarian control, governs, I argue, select groups of its citizenry via the promise of happiness. So happiness might be granted, for instance, if and only if people like Robin find ways on their own to go out to places like Ethiopia on behalf of the nation to work alongside the government and its ambitions of infrastructural upgrade and to reposition China globally via the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'll now offer some concluding thoughts to tie this all together. The idea that China constitutes a place to prototype alternatives to existing models of modern technological progress would have sounded absurd to most people 10 years ago when I started the research that informs this book. This is less so more recently. Western China commentators and news media have variously proliferated a sense that we are witnessing the rise of an emboldened China, one that more forcefully and assertively demands that the world, and the West in particular, ought to take it seriously as an equal or threatening player in the global political economy and of technology innovation in particular. Indeed, some speculate that the 21st century will be China's century. My book complicates these narratives of what historian Gabriel Hecht calls rupture talk. The notion of rupture cannot explain China's current moment, nor the ideals of the maker movement. Indeed, rupture talk renders invisible the contingencies between past and present dreams of China as an alternative model or prototype nation. It renders invisible the rise and spread, the promises of making, and the machineries of the entrepreneurial factories they are tied to. The book attends to the occluded contingencies of colonial pasts that co-produce China as prototype nation. For instance, I've shown today that the ideals and practices of a global maker movement and the imaginary of a new China were co-produced amidst a broadening suspicion of the tech industry. The tenacity of technological promise in this very moment of a broadening critique of the tech industry depended on the select recruitment of once excluded bodies and sites. In the Entrepreneurial Factory, certain forms of life are subsumed under capital production, while others are continuously excluded. It is in these exclusions, however, that we can also find gaps in the seemingly smooth operations of finance capitalism. I channel here the feminist anthropologist Anna Tsing, who reminds us, if we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope, or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin. As a feminist ethnography, Prototype Nation attends to the labor, the bodies, places, instruments, and techniques that are necessary to cultivate and maintain entrepreneurial life, like the happiness labor I've described today. I argue that if we attend to this form of labor, it becomes clear that the entrepreneurial factory is not inevitable, but it has to be nurtured and maintained. If we notice this labor, we realize that the relationship between technology and markets can indeed be otherwise. This requires us, I argue, to attend to modes of resistance that look different from this familiar image of the countercultural hacker who attacks and tears down the system. Throughout the book, and especially in chapter 5, I document the fleeting, ambiguous, and complicit acts of resistance that happiness workers engaged in. It was in their seeming futility, in their non-compliance with pitching, wherein we can notice a gap in the functional alignment of dreaming of better futures and the anticipatory logics of finance capitalism. And with this, I would like to thank and end this presentation. Thank you all for being here. Here's some more information about me and how you can reach me. My Twitter handle, my website. The book is currently 30% off with code P234 on the Princeton University website, so check it out. I now look very much forward to all your questions and comments, and I will stop the slide share as well.
Thank you so much, Silvia. We've already got a couple of questions that have come in. Shengzhou says, thank you for your great talk. The aspirational and affective framing of self-making is fascinating. I wonder if you found any counter discourses during your research that challenge the officially endorsed socialist pitch of entrepreneurial life, either from popular media or from the masses themselves?
Thank you for a great question. Some of this I alluded to at the end of the talk, where I described how happiness workers, for instance, engaged in a range of acts that on the outset don't really look at full-on resistance, but we could think of it as partially complicit, ambiguous acts that push back against some of these official narratives. And I can give you some concrete examples from my ethnography tied to some of the people I was talking about today. So I talked about the two women working in the incubator program who performed happiness labor on behalf of the program, on behalf of the startups. And their job was really to sort of enable the socialist pitch, right? To reproduce it, to create feelings that indeed what the startups were doing was of hacktivist quality, to intervene in structures of corporate monopoly or even state structures. And so in some ways, their job was actually to maintain this kind of smooth operation of the socialist pitch. And you might then wonder, like, was that all to that form of labor, right? Did they ever push back or resist, which I think is in part your question. And so this is an incident that I describe in the book in chapter 5, which is an example of their pushback, even though it might not look on the outset as anything like it. So this was a day where the startups went on another factory tour that these happiness workers, organized for them and really shaped. And this factory had particularly harsh conditions. There was no protection for the workers. It was really quite dirty and toxic fumes. And the startups were really fascinated by the machines that the factory had and sort of flocked around the machines and were kind of celebrating the laser cutters and sort of impressive instruments in the space. We then left the factory after like an hour or so, and one of the female staff, Sophie, began squatting in this dirt path in front of the factory. And the startup sort of paused, sort of the people who had come out of the building, everyone paused, and sort of people suddenly started squatting next to her, and everyone was silent for a moment. And we then got up and walked back to the subway station. And this was the first time, so it was still quiet, nobody said anything. And this was the first time the startups actually began talking about the labor conditions in the factories. So one of them also turned to me and said, Silvia, you're gonna write about this, They began reflecting on what was their role in the place. And they had never, for the months that had come before, ever talked about the labor conditions or expressed any concerns. As I said, they had been sort of fascinated by the possibility of the machines in the factories, right? And so we might ponder, Sophie's act of squatting, this wasn't like an act of resistance or mobilization that would say, let's tear down the incubator, but it created a moment of pause that I argue was very, very important, even though it might have never been deliberate on her part, but it created a moment of pause and the sort of smooth operation of the socialist pitch that I argue is important to understand as a form of resistance, even though it doesn't look like your typical countercultural resistance. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. We also have one from Yuqian Guo, who says, thank you for the talk. And could you please elaborate on a couple of things? Number one, who were the participants at the Chaihua makerspace? So what age, gender, educational level were they? And how does the makerspace attract or invite participants? Another question is how it's funded. And then so that's a set of questions. And then the second set of questions is that so some of the controversial incidents that you mentioned, for instance, in China's internet high-tech industry have occurred. And the question is, how would you make sense of the change in industry workers' attitudes? So instead of feeling happy to have a job in this industry, feeling maybe sour and disillusioned.
Great. Yeah, thank you for these questions. So the first question about Chaihua Makerspace and similar places like it, I'm assuming, in terms of what are the demographics. So Chaihua Makerspace, like many other similar makerspaces in China and many similar places elsewhere, attract a crowd of mostly college educated, not necessarily always, but mostly college educated folks, I would say in the age range between sort of 20s and 40s. There's often exceptions to that where you see younger and older participant, but that's sort of your average demographic. It is often seen as a site of fair privilege. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, makerspaces really began proliferating following the financial crisis in the years of 2007 and 2008, and that was a worldwide phenomenon. And what is perhaps most interesting about the maker movement, even though it was pitched in these kinds of revolutionary terms, as I was describing it, the critique of who was excluded from these spaces arrived very quickly. So this is very different from sort of earlier techno-optimistic visions of the 90s, where it maybe took like 2 decades to then really call them out. What we see more recently with the sort of tech lash or techno-crisis thinking, really took like maybe 20, 30 years to more publicly and broadly reckon with sort of its gender exclusions or its how they proliferate various forms of racism. With the maker movement, that happened very quickly. Within only the time span of like a couple of years, people began critiquing these spaces for who has access, who gets access, and isn't this the same kind of people who already have better education and have access to these kinds of things. So there's more to be said about how makerspaces are funded. You know, many of them have membership fees that are very small membership fees, though, and often they attract additional funding, sometimes by corporations, sometimes by government agencies. Other makerspaces refuse that and say this is a sellout, and so there's actually debate about that within sort of the maker movement itself. You know, people were actively debating about makerspaces and their complicity with capitalist structures if they did take funding. So that was often hotly debated. And so there's not one single approach, you know, in terms of how makerspaces get funding. So the second question about, maybe real quick, how workers, you know, relate to sort of some of these government initiatives, and is there a broader reckoning with sort of these issues, perhaps of precarious work structures. And I think my story today about Robin is really telling here, because I think a lot of the people who I met, even though they're very, at times often quite critical of not getting government support directly, but you know, of being sort of, you know, the demand to sort of produce some of these innovations, connections and transnational entrepreneurial connections is really put on their shoulders. Like, they're often quite critical about that, complain about that, and yet they do feel a sense of responsibility because so much is at stake, right? Not only their own jobs and their own careers, but also the image of the nation. So this is something that I encountered quite frequently, that people, yes, they would complain, you know, and challenge some of these things, and yet they would still feel responsible to implement some of these policies on behalf of the state.
Great. Several more. We won't have time for all of them, but one of the questions from Neil McKenna is, so again, getting back to the demographics, are most of the makers who use the spaces, are they local, or are they local to the areas of the entrepreneurial factories, or do they actually have work permits in different areas? Who are they, and also where are they? So are there locations other than Shenzhen? And we know that there are all kinds now. So I wonder if you could speak to just sort of movement within these spaces.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Neil. So following the 2015 policy that I was talking about today, there was, you know, thousands of such spaces that supposedly set up all over China. So I couldn't possibly visit all of these spaces, you know, but you know, a couple of surveys were conducted in the years to follow, and some public data released. And so there was like thousands of such spaces, and across different cities, across different sites in China. And some of the people who had been sort of involved in Chaihuan and some of these early maker spaces felt quite ambivalent about that, because there were stories circulating about like, oh, like a hair salon is now claiming to be a mass maker space. And so people were on the one hand excited about that sort of proliferation of their aspirations and ideas, and yet there was sort of a hesitation. And a lot of people would say, and would sort of critique local governments and saying, oh, the local governments don't get it, you know, and they are not implementing this in a way that, you know, even the central government seems to be endorsing it, sort of a more typical story. And broadly, in terms of how local governments are often critiqued also for being corrupt. So, but then what is, I think, crucial in terms of understanding what some of these gradual upgrades that I was describing today, what they did, and they didn't just occur in Shenzhen. I'm just using it as a concrete examples to show what the Entrepreneurial Factory was meant to do in terms of how to mobilize people working in engineering and in the manufacturing industry to compel them to reskill and quote unquote upgrade themselves on their own. But I saw similar phenomena happening in other cities. For instance, in mass maker spaces set up at university spaces, in high schools, which were really aimed sort of at more broadly re-educating the population through these sort of like notions of self-investment and self-entrepreneurship.
Great. Okay, so I think we only have time for one more, and Bill Phillips asks, do you also explore Han-ness as well as whiteness in your ethnography?
That's a great question. So what was really important for me to highlight in my work was these forms of racisms that I saw operate in this very transnational space of making incubator innovation type spaces. So, the incubator, for instance, that I was talking about today, for instance, was foreign funded, was run through a Silicon Valley type investment firm. And there were many spaces like that, but I really wanted to emphasize how spaces like it and their attachment not only to Silicon Valley, but also to whiteness and to particular forms of masculine enactments of tech production was one of the reasons why they were also then endorsed and taken up through these government initiatives. So very seldom, though, do we talk about, these sort of intersecting forms of racisms, in the context of China. And so my sort of commitment here was really to intervene in sort of both how we think about how racism is produced via spaces that are often celebrated as open, peer production, participatory, but also how they are reproduced in this particular transnational geopolitical configuration. And so while my own research isn't taking us outside of that context of Han-ness per se, because I haven't done, research with other minorities in China, I really situate, my critical analysis of race and racism in that transnational space.
Great, thank you. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions today, but thank you to all of you for attending and for your fascinating questions. And thank you especially to you, Silvia, for sharing with us your book and the work you've done over the past 10 years. Really quite impressive and illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for these great questions. It's been an absolute delight.